Sure, pal, sure. Listen to me. The thing about Ray is, he's a good earner. He talks a lot of shit, but he's a good earner. Tabi?
He's a rat, doing an impression of a man.
That's pretty good.
10 years younger than Jimmy Pegorino, and 9 years older than Ray Pacino. Phil Bell to me has always appeared to be the most honest and somewhat level-headed out of all the people tied to the Pegorino crime syndicate. But that still doesn't exactly mean he's had a clean record by staying out of trouble or even getting the proper recognition he's owed within his own organization. That latter fact is quite unfortunate because the only reason he was never given his proper recognition lay in the simple fact that he was more Irish than Italian. And if anything, that's a perfect reminder of just how close-minded Pegorino was, and that mentality ultimately severely handicapped Phil's success at being anything more than just an associate. A very specific detail that even helped encourage some infighting, as Ray was sure to constantly use it in order to undermine Phil's power and trust by Jimmy. Needless to say, the fact of Phil being held to a lower standard because of his heritage is just another small detail with the Pegorinos that adds to the hilarious irony of wanting to be perceived as legitimate, adhering to the rules and the way things should be done by established families, as they also do things that just doesn't make any sense and add to them just being nothing more than a giant joke, as they simultaneously break and outright ignore those very same rules. But of course, that's more tied to Jimmy than to Phil. Phil, on the other hand, has actually had a very long-running history with Jimmy despite him being locked in place due to his background. He still very much even helps control a large part with Pegorino's organization. By contrast, where Ray operated out of his own restaurant in Little Italy, he went on to handle the alliances between Pegorino and other organizations like the McRae family, for instance, as he attempted to be bigger and more than he really was. Phil, on the other hand, appeared to be one that played a little closer to the chest. He still worked out of Alderney, which was considerably closer to Pegorino and their operation than Ray. He managed a handful of construction yards that he used to help claim he was a legitimate business owner while also running the Honkers Gentlemen's Club, which was owned by Pegorino. He even appeared to be the most cautious and considerate on the repercussions that could come their way, based off talking too loudly or doing things without, at the very least, Pegorino's blessing.
I've known Phil a long time. He's straight, more or less. I know him and Angie are friends, but that don't worry me too much. Maybe he's too straight. Then there's Ray. Him and Phil hate each other.
Phil was born in 1967 in Alderney City. Despite his overwhelming Irish heritage, he does appear to act as if he is full Italian, which could also be a huge indicator for what it was like for him growing up within Alderney City. There doesn't sound to be many criminal organizations or any real opportunity outside of working with the Pegorinos, at least during his childhood and teenage years. Of course, throughout the story of Grand Theft Auto 4, we do see both the Pavanos and the Ancelottis make moves within Alderney, but their main operations stay within Algonquin, with, from what I can tell, no real prospects of making any consistent cash over in Alderney until the events of the main story. Otherwise, if falling into a life of crime was all that was guaranteed or exciting for Phil, it would then make sense as to why the Pegorinos would be where he ended up. Prior to Jimmy taking over, his father ran the whole operation. Although even under his father's leadership, it sounded like it really never went anywhere. In fact, if Jimmy's own words were to be believed, he had actually done more than his father could ever hope to achieve. Honestly, it's a little hard to really fathom just how Jimmy's father was because, well, Jimmy is a delusional liar that tends to put himself on a higher pedestal than he deserves, and his fascination with joining the commission and trying to appear legitimate does muddy the waters a bit in terms of what his father could have actually achieved, because I believe Jimmy's idea of success is more appearance-based than anything else. And I say that because since we also don't know when his father died and when he took over, there may be a real distinction between the Pegorinos under the leadership of Jimmy's father versus the organization under Jimmy, at least in terms of their outward appearance, with such a heavy emphasis on becoming a legitimate family. And if we return to the LCPD records here, there's an interesting pattern between Jimmy, Phil, and really eventually Ray. In terms of Jimmy and Phil specifically, both of their first arrest was under the charge of Grand Theft Auto, with the men only being 1 year apart in their ages when initially arrested. Jimmy would have been 16 in 1973, while Phil was brought into custody at 17 years old in 1984. 4 years later, he was caught in a second charge for promoting gambling, and 4 years after that, arrested for pooping in the park in 1989. By contrast, and I do want to point this out here as I feel like it's important enough to mention, I did end up finding 2 different Pegorino records. Now, they're almost the exact same except for one particular charge, which both took place in 1981. In his initial charge, he was arrested for promoting gambling, which is the exact old photo I've had from my old Pegorino video from months before. But now it says in 1981 he was arrested for public masturbation and not promoting gambling. It's a slight discrepancy, but still worth noting, as that means he and Phil, whom by the mid-1980s and early 90s were most likely already working together, were both caught for either promoting gambling or both of them committing some sort of indecent exposure out in the public. Whatever the case, the 80s to 90s appear to be where they would find themselves within the most amount of trouble, and Phil eventually catching his last charge for racketeering in 2005. It was during this exact same year Jimmy was arrested for the exact same charge. So by then, it must have become apparent to the police the 2 men are working together, finally zeroing in on their pattern of criminal history and the fact that these 2 may be the only consistent faces from Alderney, trying to become bigger than what they were. Consequently, Phil had already established a pretty lengthy list of notes by the Liberty City Police Department, making it quite clear they knew he was a chief lieutenant within the Pegorino crime syndicate, was not a quote-unquote made man based off his heritage. They knew he was extremely paranoid of wiretaps and being closely watched, most likely a result of his constant arrests, and despite knowing he managed the Honkers Gentlemen's Club owned by Pegorino, Phil continued to claim he was a legitimate businessman based off his construction yards he at some point in time ended up acquiring. I think it's the best time as any to add that Phil does also at some point get married, and has more than one child with his wife. The marriage unfortunately ended up falling through, with a court order stating he must stay away from his children, and as he puts it, keep his distance from his malicious bitch of an ex-wife. Now, we don't know exactly if that racketeering charge is what caused his marriage to crumble, if it happened before or after it, but to simplify it, by 2005, legally speaking, he was already well known to be tied to the Pegorino crime syndicate, was experiencing severe paranoia, the very same he was seen having in 2008, thus revealing it to be a constant long-running fear of his way before Nico ever came along, and he already had a horrible divorce. But for me, that still doesn't quite fully address the reason why Phil is so concerned with law enforcement and paranoid as he is. I mean, yes, we do know Pegorino is under surveillance in 2008. Even his wife is well aware of it, claiming to be waving at federal agents parked across the street from their house, until they eventually inventoried Pegorino's home by getting his doorman Anthony to turn and wear a wire. But like I was saying, for Phil, there appears to be so much more tied to that. And I think that may be due to him just being more aware and level-headed than Ray and Jimmy. If you listen to his explanation to Nico and why he's making sure Nico's already checked their car for bugs as they head out to steal a shipment of cocaine from the Russians, he claims when you get busted for big things like what they're about to do, you get sentenced for a very long time. That very sentence could lead to your own people whacking you as an insurance policy. Phil believes he's a prime candidate for being whacked because of the fear other people will have on him, turning state because, as he puts it, he knows enough about their organization to destroy their entire operation. And it's that very dialogue that betrays his real concern over being killed.
You're working with the wrong people if you expect them to whack you if you go inside. Where's the trust, Phil?
It's about survival. If someone who knew what I knew got flipped, then the whole organization will down. Whacking someone who catches some heavy time is just an insurance policy. And it don't help that not everyone in the organization is pulling in the same direction.
You mean that someone in the family would see someone else going inside as an opportunity to get ahead?
You're a smart guy. Anyways, excuse me if I'd want to be absolutely sure that we got our asses covered.
It's easy to say the person who stands to benefit out of everyone is Ray. Jimmy doesn't seem smart enough to really consider Phil being a proper threat, or trying to hit someone who's already inside of police custody is something I think he would ever aim to actually do. But for Ray, who is known to not only not like Phil, but use proper justification to get rid of him once and for all. To me, it stands to reason that is exactly who he's talking about. Let's not forget, around the same time, the commission and established families within Liberty City are all collectively under heat, from the LCPD with major news outlets even reporting how prominent family members are beginning to turn on their organizations every single day. The biggest of which is Dogmeat. Dogmeat, whose real name is Vito Minotti, who we unfortunately don't ever get to see in game, but is shared through this article, got his nickname due to his ownership of a dog food processing plant. That same plant was both how he laundered money and admitted to disposing of the bodies of victims he committed hits on. Dog Meat was a prolific hitman in the early 90s, but according to the Liberty Tree newspaper, Vito Minotti is achieving headlines because recently he appeared before a judge at the Civic Citadel and provided evidence against his former family, the Pavanos. The terms of the deal he struck with the DA meant he will gain a new identity, be placed under witness protection, and relocated on the contingency of the evidence he provided, leading to the arrest of several other high-ranking Pavano members. Within the same article, Dog Meat is seen as a major trophy, but is also written as just another one of recent mobsters who have turned. And this article does also mention how Alderney-based mobsters are trying to take over Liberty City rackets, and gangsters are coming over from Eastern Europe. Now, we've outlined many times in previous videos how Eastern European and Russian mob is ultimately the main threats to the city's underground status quo. So those are the organizations the IAA, FIB, Noose, and John Gravelli ultimately all focus on. But it's the quote of Alderney-based mobsters that should not go under our radar. Don't get tricked by that wording. The Pegorinos are not mobsters, but in almost a realistic fashion, while other families and even the police department recognize that to be the case, newspaper articles and quotes from those who don't know any better do in fact refer to the Pegorinos as mobsters and a family when they aren't. And that can be confirmed with this follow-up newspaper, also by the Liberty Tree. This article is relevant because it details how the commission has continued to have its grip within the city, weakened more and more by the efforts of law enforcement, creating opportunities for this so-called new class of mobster or criminal to step in. That, of course, being the Alderney-based family, who in other words is the Pegorino crime syndicate that's tied to allegations and even charges of multiple armed robberies, extortion, and racketeering. This article also acknowledges how this new mobster has done nothing but leave a trail of bodies. Thus, Pegorino's notoriety is only growing by the day. Meanwhile, Phil continues to become all the more paranoid of his own organization and the police overhearing something he says or is doing, giving his own the opportunity to take him out once and for all. Now, with all of everything I've covered on Phil, you would think he's useless, too timid to make moves, and overly concerned with watching his own back. However, when you really look at what he does, the missions tied to him, and how he basically falls in line with whatever Pegorino tells him to do, it makes it very hard to consider him anything else besides loyal and committed to an organization that sadly limited his and its own potential.
Because these is the orders, and we gotta follow them. That's the way things work. You ain't gonna be happy about everything you get told to do, are you?
You're the boss. It ain't like I'm working for free.
No, you ain't, and I ain't neither. That's why we gotta at least try to do what we're told to do. You're gonna learn that there ain't much in this life that you got control of. Whether you're putting yourself in harm's way because that's the way the skipper wants it done, or you're staying away from your kids because of a stupid court order and a malicious bitch of an ex-wife. There ain't that much control in anything.
Truck Hustle is the first mission officially given to Nico by Phil. Even though it's Phil's job, he didn't immediately head to Nico for help in seeing it done. Rather, he initially asked Ray for his help, who flat out refused but offered Nico services in his place. This initial job, tied to stealing a truckload of heroin off of the triads, according to Phil, appeared to be the perfect opportunity because they believed it was cursed and were eager to get it off their hands no matter the price. He then orders Nico to prove to them it was in fact cursed by taking it from them. Now, to be clear, this is not the same heroin shipment that is stolen by the Angels of Death, later taken by Johnny in the Lost to then be sold with the help of Elizabeth Torres. That is an entirely different shipment that does still help build the depth and overall quantity of heroin shipments the Triads were moving into Liberty City. But still, through this mission, which is really straightforward as there's no continuous dialogue throughout the mission compared to the rest of Phil's other jobs, we know Phil has some kind of fillers out within the city, probably other members within the Pegorino crime syndicate, paying close attention to any moves being made within Alderney City. His paranoia does sound to impact the speed of how things are moved because after taking the truckload of heroin to Phil's nephew Frankie laments over how he has to sit on this whole shipment until Phil gives the all clear. and who knows how long that'll be. But in the meantime, it's up to him to repackage it all into smaller, faster vehicles so they can later ship it out. Now, we'll return to this as I'll be following the natural progression of missions with Phil, as I think it's important in regards to how he's presented overall. But keep in mind that in the following job, we know Jimmy has a hand in it and is ultimately the main planner behind that job. Whereas here in Truck Hustle, there doesn't sound to be a role played by Pegorino. And I say that because there's no proper reference to it or any holes in the planning, with Nico pointing it out and Phil just falling back on the explanation of saying this is how Pegorino essentially mapped it out for them, and so they need to follow it accordingly. Which is exactly what he does in the following mission called Catch the Wave. This mission is interesting because Phil learns more about Nico and the nature of his work with Ray during the beginning, as he tries to get Nico to understand the kind of terminology the rest of them use by asking if Ray is a quote-unquote friend of his. Nico says it plainly, he's just a slime ball that pays, or a rat doing an impression of a man. Nico's straightforward response on how he views Ray amuses Phil, and I think for the second time, or really the first time these two men are left alone to have a proper one-on-one conversation. It's a nice first step in letting us see how Phil, a somewhat close associate of Ray, sees him, which is something that's all the more important because at this point in time, Nico has only barely met Pegorino and has had the most exposure to Ray out of all three of them. It's apparent Ray's ambitious, yet extremely submissive to Pegorino at the same time, while Phil has a more honored and respectable approach to orders and handling the business that falls within his side of the Pegorino crime syndicate. Now, out of all the missions Nico works with Jimmy, Phil, and Ray, I think it's both this mission, Catch the Wave, and the following mission, titled Trespass, that shows the whole operation somewhat work together. For starters, the whole premise of the mission, Catch the Wave, could never have worked if it wasn't for Nico and Gerald McCreary actively doing their best to weaken the alliance between the Ancelottis and the Albanian mobs. Now, technically, Ray's the connection from Pegorino to the McCrearys, so even though he isn't directly seen in the jobs handed by Gerald, I think it's only fair to at least give him a bit of credit on working as the connection between them. Since Gerald and Nico successfully managed to break that alliance up, the Ancelottis then moved to work with the Russians in bringing in cocaine into the city. One way or another, Pegorino caught wind of this, and sounds to have originally set a plan in motion to steal the same truck from the Ancelottis the Russians were expecting them to pick the cocaine up in. From there, the Russians were expected to load up the cocaine for these imposters, and it should just be smooth sailing. Of course, Nico points out no one is dumb enough to just get rid of a load of cocaine, which then leads to not only Phil explaining it's the one plan Pegorino personally worked out, but it's also one he's going to follow because that's just the way things work. Going on to add, in life you're not always going to like what you're told to do, but you learn there's not much you can have control over. Whether if that's foolishly putting yourself in harm's way and not putting together a smarter plan to deal with the Russians, since both he and Nico knew beforehand they will most likely have to kill every single Russian goon there. Yet despite knowing that beforehand, as well as just getting caught off guard with the sudden arrival of the shipment of cocaine, which was expected to show up 3 days later and not today, they still opted to commit to the original plan of just pulling up to the gates and parking the truck in the middle of the Russian compound. It shows in practice Phil was really committed to his idea of not having real control over events in his life. Now, because that's also tied to that same string of dialogue of not having control over things in his life, putting yourself in harm's way because Pegorino told him to, or abiding by his stupid court order to keep away from his kids and his ex-wife, it's worth again highlighting the comment about his wife, as it gives valuable insight to his more personal life and touch on an aspect of him that really isn't explored all that much, but is still connected to this overarching philosophy of believing you don't have the ability to take control over events in your life, whether that is pertaining to the business side or even his more intimate life, kept privately to himself and those closest to him. And maybe that's why he continues to stick to the Pegorinos as a whole, despite everything. Holding out with Jimmy as long as he does because it's just the way the rules of loyalty is. After all, he's 41 years old. Much of what he knows is, if not directly taught by Pegorino, learned and lived by within the rules of sticking to this lifestyle that has undoubtedly dominated his entire adult life. It almost makes you feel bad because he's clearly intelligent but sidelines his intellect in favor of following orders. As I mentioned a moment ago, the follow-up mission for him is Trespass, which still has that continuity, the whole Pegorino crime syndicate working together, because it's a direct result of what Nico and Phil did. After stealing the cocaine from the Russians and killing all of their men, they somehow found out Pegorino's organization was responsible. So Phil sends Nico to take out a high-ranking Ancelotti capo to prevent him from returning to the commission and informing them the Pegorinos are ripping off the Ancelottis and getting involved with the doings of established families. Now, the more and more I think about this mission, I wonder what the credibility is on the Ancelottis actually heading over to the commission and tell them about what the Pegorinos were up to. I mean, for one, the Pegorinos were never an established family, meaning they don't need approval from the commission to deal with them. Unless there's some unknown agreement between all of the families on just leaving the Pegorinos be because they are absorbing all the heat from law enforcement, I don't see any justification or proper explanation as to why they would be heading to the commission. But even if that was the case though, John Gravelli, head of the Gambetti crime family and most powerful of all the families within Liberty City, both hated the Ancelottis dealing with drugs within Liberty City and the fact that it was supplied by the Russians who were constantly muscling in on contracts his family owned just added salt to the wound. So I would love to really know the purpose of the Ancelotti capo heading to Algonquin to begin with. It is possible things just became too heated in Alderney for him, and he was retreating, and the ever-paranoid Pegorinos, especially Jimmy, who's hypersensitive to anything negative returning to the commission, may have just misinterpreted it all and killed a capo out of fear of something that wasn't actually happening. More importantly though, when we look at it from Phil's perspective, it does nothing but further outline how he committed more to just serving Jimmy and following his wishes instead of taking advantage of opportunities and doing his best to further his own gains like Ray actively was. These two missions alone compared to Ray's whole hiring of Johnny Klebitz to steal diamonds tied to the Ancelottis without Pegorino's knowledge, even doing it after he was told and knew to stay away from them, fumbles it further with Nico multiple times, only to come begging for forgiveness after the entire mess leaks out. I don't mean to actively make this a Ray versus Phil type of breakdown, simply highlight the difference in mission and approaches to help further understand why and the ways these two men were at odds. Meanwhile, though, that original shipment of heroin stolen by the Triads was sat on, with it later going on to be what Pegorino believes is his ticket back to the top, and recovering after he had Ray killed out of just sending a message, of showing everyone around him that he does in fact mean business, and feds slowly ripping apart his entire operation.
Okay, I'll see you later.
Yeah, okay.
Take care now.
I'll see you later. Give me a call.
Hey,
It's not what it looks like.
okay?
It's not like that. Talk. So do us all a favor and keep quiet.
Shit, Frankie, you dumb fuck! The feds have been watching us all along. Nico, get in that car and follow me.
Despite there being a pretty big mistake on Frankie's part, completely missing the fact the heroin under his watch was indeed under law enforcement surveillance, this utter lack of awareness does completely undermine Phil's entire cooling off period of just keeping the heroin stashed somewhere, while the potential heat of anyone watching it beforehand dies down. The revelation of it being closely watched by the police thus has the added effect of confirming Phil's suspicion and making his whole over-the-top paranoia, at least over-the-top paranoia contrasted to Pegorino and Ray, be much more rooted in reality. And for me, that touch has always been the perfect twist of fate because Phil, through his own logic, reasoning, and even his willingness to do the jobs he hands out himself right next to Nico, apart from trespass where he claims he can't be seen anywhere near it, due to essentially sanctioning a hit on a made man, where Jimmy's basically a delusional moron and Ray's an ambitious two-face, you would then logically expect the third main man within the organization to have something about him that makes you equally wary and trusting or believing anything he says. For Phil, the only two things that ever stuck out was his fear of being watched, and I would say his supposed close relationship or friendship with Pegorino's wife, Angie. The former's confirmation makes him appear less like a lunatic, while the latter, while still debatable, is hard to concretely say one way or the other, as there really isn't much evidence to properly go off of besides Jimmy acknowledging he knows Phil and Angie are close friends, but that doesn't bother him. Phil does get defensive and angry with Nico when he does catch him and Angie talking within his own office, and that does lead to some paranoia of Nico supposedly trying to blackmail him when he asks if there's a possibility that he can ask for some type of favor of looking for someone in the future. I showed part of that interaction at the start of this video's chapter, but unfortunately I can't play it as I've been having trouble getting around YouTube's copyright system thanks to Phil always blasting music in his office to drown out any audio wiretaps that may pick up incriminating evidence. Even with this hiccup, I still wanted to point out this particular scene because it is significant for a few reasons. Because since Ray appears to do his best to weaponize Phil's and Angie's friendship, I'd give him the benefit of the doubt here and say it could just be low-hanging fruit he's tired of being leveraged against him, explaining the somewhat aggressive defensiveness he exhibits towards Nico, who simply says he doesn't mean to take advantage, but he hopes with everything he's been doing for Phil, he can call in a favor to find out information about someone. That someone being Darko Brevich, but of course, Phil has no idea about Nico's own personal crusade, and thus responds in a way that would provide us an insight to the type of backstabbing opportunities Phil has either been somewhat surrounded by, or is just actively expecting at this point within his life. However, there are two other elements of Phil's that could make it still go one way or the other. On the possibility of some kind of infidelity being committed between Phil and Angie, that would be a massive hole if I don't at the very least address. For one, there's the ugly divorce potentially playing a role in how he sees married women, especially tied to the boss, who he actively follows orders for no matter what, furthering putting up a decent argument of it being a genuine friendship. But then with Jimmy, I would easily believe his view on Phil and Angie's friendship could be no different than his view on Ray. Jimmy foolishly believes Ray could, nor would, ever rise to the same level he is because Ray's too busy thinking about himself, too short-sighted to consider every possibility as Pegorino supposedly does. He even thinks Ray is harmless, bites off more than he can chew, and then eventually comes sniveling back because he needs his help. But even that isn't really a proper assessment of Ray and his level of disobedience in listening and respecting Pegorino as the actual boss here. So I do think that level of ignorance and misplaced self-assurance is quite possible. But again, there really isn't any concrete evidence to say definitively. If we return to Phil and the limited time spent with Nico, though, a mutual respect really does appear to have formed between the pair. Through the number of videos I have covered in Grand Theft Auto 4, I've always tried to point out Nico's feelings and level of respect towards certain characters based on what they do and how honest they are with themselves and with Nico about what they really are. And with Phil all the way to the very end of the entire Pegorino arc, he stuck it out with Jimmy as much as he could, in both endings fighting alongside him when Nico takes the deal or getting that final phone call from him when Nico opts for revenge instead. Phil expresses his understanding of Nico's decision, respecting it, and choosing to respectfully stay away from each other in light of recent events. Out of all the characters Nico meets throughout Grand Theft Auto 4, had circumstances been different for Phil, and even if he wasn't tied to the Pegorino crime syndicate, I could see him becoming another little Jacob or Packy, always there ready to help whenever needed.
Hey, Phil, I understand why you made the decision you did. For what it's worth, I didn't trust that Dimitri's either.
Yeah, well, I did what I had to do.
Anyway, you and me can't talk no more. Jimmy's falling apart, and Pegorino's ain't nothing no more. I'm out, man. Goodbye.